death to immortality. Om, peace, peace, peace. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of a crash course in Vedanta. I think a couple of you probably missed part 1. Is that right?
Yes. It's called half of the document.
You cut half of it. Okay. So I thought what I'd do is actually recap what we did in part 1 a little bit, very briefly, and then we'll move on to part 2. Today's gets a little bit kind of more complicated, so I'm going to try to go a little bit slowly. But so the recap first. Vedanta. So a little quiz for those of you who actually attended last time. Vedanta is comprised of 2 words, Veda and Anta, right? So what does Anta mean in Vedanta? Anyone?
Culmination.
Yeah, good. Right, so Vedanta is a culmination of the Vedas in the form of which texts? Which texts are considered to be the culmination of the Vedas?
Upanishad.
Very good, yeah, exactly, the Upanishads. So those are the authoritative scriptures for all Vedantins, of all stripes. Today we'll be talking about some of the different schools of Vedanta. There are many different schools. Advaita Vedanta is one of many. But all of them accept the authority of the Upanishads. And more broadly, they accept the authority of the Prasthanatraya, the 3 scriptural pillars of Vedanta. What are those 3 scriptural pillars? You already said the first one, the Upanishads. What are the 2 other pillars which comprise the Prasthanatraya?
Bhagavad Gita and Brahma Sutra.
Very good, exactly. Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutra. But the thing is, these scriptures are very ancient texts, and some of the verses in mantras are quite cryptic and can be interpreted in different ways. And so all of these different schools within Vedanta take these 3 scriptures to be authoritative, but interpret them in different ways. Sometimes in drastically different ways. And that's a whole another course, so we're not going to go into too many details on that. But all of them are claiming that we are giving the correct and authoritative interpretation of the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. And they're all disagreeing with each other. They have all these debates with each other about it. Fundamental things like Brahman. Brahman is considered ultimate reality, right? But what is Brahman? Is Brahman Vishnu? Is Brahman personal God? Or is Brahman impersonal, pure consciousness? Everything is up for grabs when it comes to how to interpret these really fundamental doctrines in the Upanishads. Okay? Alright, so that was one of the big things that we talked about. And we talked about some of the main similarities across the different schools of Vedanta. So let me see. I think I have a slide on this. Okay, so first of all, to review, here are some of the main schools of Vedanta. First, Advaita Vedanta. And often people make the mistake of equating Vedanta with Advaita Vedanta. It's very common to do this. They talk about Vedanta, but what they actually mean is Advaita Vedanta. Advaita means what? Yeah.
Non-dual.
Non-dual, very good, exactly. Non-duality. The non-dual school of Vedanta is only one of many, as you can see from the chart. And this is not exhaustive. There are other schools also within Vedanta. And so the second school, for instance, is called Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, qualified non-dualism of Ramananda. And Madhva school is called Madhva Vedanta or Dvaita Vedanta, dualistic Vedanta. Dvaita means 2. Actually, there's more than, it's a little inaccurate to call it Dvaita Vedanta. That's why I prefer Madhva Vedanta. It just means the school of Madhva. Part of the reason why I think it's misleading is because they don't just believe that there are 2 entities. There are more than 2 entities. Whereas Samkhya is more of a dualism, because Samkhya philosophy only accepts Purusha and Prakriti as the 2 fundamental entities. But Madhva school is broader than that. He accepts God, he accepts this world of insentient entities, he also accepts different individual souls. And what he emphasizes is that there are pancha bheda. There are differences between you as a soul and you as a soul. There are differences between this table and that chair. There are differences between God and each of us. And so on and so forth. So he emphasizes differences. So in that sense, dualism. is that he's very much reacting against Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Shankara says there's only one reality, and it's non-dual pure consciousness, and each of us is identical with non-dual pure consciousness. In reality, there's no difference between me and pure consciousness. And Madhva strongly reacts against that. He says, he denies this. And he says, there is a very strong difference between us, who are just individual souls, and God on the other hand. Because God is Vishnu, the personal God. And he's infinite and supreme, and we're these ordinary souls. We're like servants of this supreme God, basically. Okay? Okay, so that's the third school. Fourth school is called Bheda Vedanta. Bheda means, do you know what Bheda means?
Differentiation.
Yeah, difference. Yeah, exactly. And Abheda means the opposite, non-difference. So this is a very strange doctrine, but the school upholds the doctrine of Bheda, which means difference and non-difference. Which seems contradictory, but the idea is that, in one sense, Brahman is non-different from this world, for instance. In another sense, Brahman is different from this world. So one of the standard examples used by people who follow the school of Veda is like, imagine an ocean, and imagine that it forms into a wave. In one sense, the wave is non-different from the ocean, in a kind of obvious sense. It's nothing but water, it's nothing but the ocean, right? In another sense, it's different from the ocean. The wave is different from the ocean. In what sense? How is the wave different from the ocean? This isn't that hard.
Many waves in the ocean.
Huh?
The many waves in the ocean.
Yeah, and they're, small. I mean, a wave is like this big, and the ocean is vast, and so, right? The wave only lasts for a couple seconds at most. The ocean kind of is stable and lasts much longer, and so on and so forth. There are those kinds of differences, right? At the same time, it's non-different because it's nothing but the same ocean water, right? So they use these kinds of metaphors. Another one they use is a spark in a fire. Right? In one sense, the spark is not different from the fire, from the bigger fire. In another sense, the spark is just a tiny part of that much larger fire, and so it's different, right? So in that way, this school of Bheda Vedanta upholds the difference and the non-difference between what? Brahman on the one hand and this world on the other, and also between Brahman and each of us as individual souls. So each of us is like a wave in this vast Brahman ocean. Okay? But even within Bheda Vedanta, you see how complicated it gets. There are at least 4 different sub-schools. There are more than 4, but I mentioned 4 sub-schools. All of them are also they fall under Bheda, but they're actually quite different. And I'm not going to go into details, but Aupadika Bheda is the school of Bhaskara. Bhaskara was a contemporary of Shankara's, way back in the 8th century. Nimbarka, so the last 3, Nimbarka school of Swabhavika Bheda, Chaitanya, you must have heard of Chaitanya, right? Okay. Chaitanya school of Achintya Bheda Vedanta, otherwise known as Gaudiya Vaishnavism, and Vallabha school of Shuddhadvaita Vedanta. All of these are, these last 3, like Nimbarka, Chaitanyas, and Vallabha schools, are considered to be Vaishnava schools. And actually, so is Ramanuja's and Madhva school. Okay? So, but there's a slight difference. So, Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita Vedanta thinks of Brahman as Vishnu. The supreme God is Vishnu. Madhva, same thing, Vishnu. But these 3 schools at the bottom, Nimbarka, Chaitanya, and Vallabha, these 3 schools, believe the supreme reality is Krishna, specifically Krishna. Okay? Any questions about this overall kind of landscape of the different schools and sub-schools within Vedanta before we move on? So this is more or less where we were, this is where we left off last time. Okay? So we're going to move forward. And I've been told that I speak too quickly, and so I'll try to speak a little bit more slowly. Oh, this is also kind of review, so I'm just going to recap this as well. We talked about this last time. Before we get into some of the subtle differences among the different schools of Vedanta, here are some of the fundamental similarities. First, all of them believe in the authority of the Prasthanatraya. Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutra. We already talked about that, right? But they interpret these scriptures in very different ways. Okay? Number 2, all of these different schools of Vedanta hold that we suffer because we are ignorant of the ultimate reality of Brahman. because we don't know the ultimate reality. And secondly, because we are mistaken about our true nature. We think that we're physical bodies, but in fact we're not. Somewhat more evolved people think that they're minds, but even that's not true. In fact, ultimately, we are neither physical bodies nor the mind, but we are eternal souls, or jivatmas, separate from the body-mind complex. Every school of Vedānta upholds this doctrine. This is number 2. Okay? Alright. Number 3. Oh yeah, well, okay, so I'm going to combine 2 and 3 together. We are not the ephemeral body-mind complex, but the eternal soul. 4. We can gain knowledge of the ultimate reality, Brahman, through certain spiritual practices. And they all agree on some of these fundamental spiritual practices. One is renunciation of sense pleasures and worldly attachments. They all agree that meditation plays an important role. But when you get to the details, we'll talk about this eventually, either toward the end of this class or in part 3. They usually privilege one spiritual practice above all the others and say that this yoga alone leads to the highest goal of liberation. Okay? So bhakti schools will not surprisingly privilege bhakti yoga, the spiritual practice of devotion, bhakti. Whereas Advaita Vedanta will privilege, not coincidentally, jnana yoga, the path of knowledge, saying that only the path of knowledge can take you to the highest goal of liberation directly. Okay? And 5. All of the schools of Vedanta hold that knowledge of Brahman leads to salvation. Salvation is kind of a Christian term. Liberation we can use instead. Freedom from rebirth. Liberation from rebirth and eternal bliss. Complete total freedom from suffering. And it's only knowledge of Brahman that leads to liberation. Okay? Any questions about this before we move on? Alright, so we're going to start getting into some of the subtle differences among the different schools of Vedanta. So the first big question is, what exactly is the nature of Brahman? All of these schools of Vedanta accept that the ultimate reality is Brahman, but they differ in how they understand what Brahman is. Okay? And so Advaita Vedanta, of all of these schools of Vedanta, is the only one that holds that Brahman is ultimately impersonal, attributeless, non-dual, pure consciousness. Okay? And every other school of Vedanta is theistic, which means that they believe that Brahman is really the opposite. It's saguna instead of nirguna. Advaita Vedantas believe that Brahman is nirguna, which means completely devoid of all attributes, strictly non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness. Theistic schools believe that Brahman is saguna, which means it's the personal God. Meaning either understood as Vishnu or as Krishna with the omni attributes. Did we talk about omni attributes? I think we talked about them, was it last time or? What are the omni attributes? Yeah, what are the omni attributes? Anyone? No? This is a good clue. What are some of the attributes of God normally that begin with OMNI?
Omniscience.
Yeah, exactly. What's another one?
Omnipotence.
Omnipotence. Yes. And there's one that's a little bit more technical.
Omnipresence.
Huh?
Omnipresence.
Omnipresence, that's good. Very good. There's a fourth one, which is like a more technical term for perfectly good or perfectly loving. Philosophers use the term omnibenevolence. It just means perfectly loving. Okay? So these are the gunas, these are the attributes which the theistic schools of Vedanta claim are the attributes of Brahman, understood as a personal God. So they say, Shankara, you're wrong. Brahman is not impersonal. Philosophy is not so dry as that. The ultimate reality is the personal God. Ramanuja and Madhva call the personal God Vishnu. Chaitanya school, Vallabha school, Nimbarka school call that Brahman or ultimate reality Krishna. But all of them believe that this supreme personal being has these wonderful omni attributes, and that he creates, preserves, and destroys this world, and many other things. That he loves us, that he listens to our prayers, he responds to our prayers. It's by his grace that we make spiritual progress and ultimately attain liberation. So all these things. Okay? Okay. Whoa, how did I hit the bicycle? I hit it by accident. Okay, we're still on this slide. Okay, so one thing I wanted to mention, another kind of subtle difference among the different schools of Vedanta. Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, this is the third bullet point. So Ramanuja school and Madhva school, okay? And many schools of Veda, they hold that Brahman is exclusively saguna, exclusively personal. Meaning Brahman is not impersonal at all. So they just completely reject Shankara's understanding of Brahman. And they say, Shankara, you're wrong. Nirguna Brahman does not even exist. They deny the existence of the impersonal, non-dual absolute. Okay? So they're completely conflicting with each other. But there are at least two schools of Vedanta. Please look at number 4, the fourth bullet point. Shuddhadvaita, the Shuddhadvaita school of Vedanta, founded by Vallabha, and Achinta Bheda Vedanta of Chaitanya. They hold that ultimate reality is both Nirguna and Saguna. They accept both. They say, Shankara, we agree that there is such a thing as Nirguna Brahman. But that Nirguna Brahman, which you think is the highest, is just a minor aspect of our beloved Krishna. So the supreme reality is still Krishna, Saguna Brahman. Nirguna Brahman is not completely false. It's not that it doesn't exist. It exists, but it's just a minor aspect of Krishna himself. So Chaitanya's followers call Nirguna Brahman the Tanubha, or Pratibha of Krishna, which means the peripheral brilliance of Krishna. So you see how there's a kind of hierarchy in play? And Vallabha's followers use the term, it's a metaphor obviously, they say that Nirguna Brahman is the foot, the charanam of their beloved Krishna. Again, kind of putting it on a lower level. But it's not unreal, it's real. Nirguna Brahman exists. But what you guys are so crazy about is just a minor aspect of our Krishna. So there's still a sense of a higher and a lower. Do you understand? Okay. And I wanted to note here, and look at the very bottom. These two schools, these two bhakti schools of Vedanta, Achinta Bheda of Chaitanya and the Shuddhadvaita Vedanta of Vallabha, you can see them as turning the tables on Shankara school. How? Because Shankara places Nirguna Brahman on a higher footing than Saguna Brahman. How does he do that? According to Advaita Vedanta, this is one mainstream understanding of Advaita Vedanta. There are different interpretations. I'm giving you one mainstream understanding. Advaita Vedanta is based on a two-tier theory of reality. Okay? He distinguishes the Paramantika level from the Vyavaharika level. And he says that I think that I'm separate from you guys, that I'm talking to you now, that you're sitting over there, that there are a bunch of chairs here, there's a table here, there's a podium here, which means I'm perceiving all sorts of differences. What Shankara says is all these differences are only true from the Vyavaharika standpoint, from the empirical standpoint. And what is the empirical standpoint? The standpoint of avidya, ignorance. Ignorance of what? Of non-dual pure consciousness. So long as we are ignorant of our true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, we perceive this illusory world of diversity. But the moment I attain knowledge of Brahman, my own true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, what happens? I just realized that there's nothing but Brahman. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. This whole world of diversity turns out to be an illusion. You see? Including the personal God. That's what's relevant here in this section where we're talking about the nature of Brahman. The personal God, Saguna Brahman, is also, from the ultimate standpoint, non-existent. He has this term, which he uses frequently, called upadhis. This is a Sanskrit term. Upadhi means limiting adjunct. So the idea is that the only reality is non-dual pure consciousness. That's the fundamental metaphysical thesis of Advaita Vedanta. However, out of our ignorance of that non-dual pure consciousness, what do? We superimpose various upadhis onto Brahman. So this table, what is this table? It's non-dual pure consciousness with the limiting adjunct of tableness. What is that laptop? The same non-dual pure consciousness with the limiting adjunct of laptopness. What am I? The same non-dual pure consciousness with the upadhi of Swami Medhananda, and so on and so forth. Each of you can be Rahulatva. You see, one reality with different limiting adjuncts superimposed. Now, what is the personal God from that standpoint? The same non-dual, impersonal, pure consciousness with the upadhi of the personal God, Ishvaratva. And what is Ishvaratva? All these wonderful things: omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, omnibenevolence. But none of this is true from the ultimate standpoint. Do you follow? You're scratching your chin. Yeah, okay.
So are you saying that they still believe in personal
Who's the
God?
they here?
Oh, sorry.
Shankara school? Or
Well,
what?
yeah,
the
Sorry,
Shankara school.
mainstream version. They still believe in personal God. It's just that they believe that there is a higher reality, I guess. Like they still like believe it. It's like they still how they believe that you would exist, but
They put everything in this world of diversity on the same footing. So it's a little tricky. I mean, you're raising an interesting question. I mean, do they believe that the personal God exists? Yes, except from the empirical standpoint. And then when you ask, well, what does it mean for the personal God to exist from the empirical standpoint? The answer is, well, that's a standpoint of ignorance. So what they're giving with one hand, they seem to be taking away with the other. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So long as we're not aware of the reality, yes, the personal God exists. But that's as good as saying that the personal God does not actually exist.
But so would they say, for instance, that the idea of an eternal soul is more valid than, just body?
Yeah. So this is a good question. I mean, I have a kind of indirect way of answering that, which is in his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, Shankara takes on a school of Buddhism called Yogacara Buddhism. Have you heard of Yogacara Buddhism? Vasubandhu is one of the great Yogacara Buddhists. They're famous for this doctrine that this entire world is a dream. Okay? And often Advaita Vedanta is considered to hold a similar doctrine. Part of the reason is because Shankara's guru's guru was who? Does anyone know?
Gaudapada?
Yeah, very good. Gaudapada, exactly. And we have one text of Gaudapada's which remains. What is that? Gaudapada composed a great text called Mandukya Karika. It's a verse commentary on the Mandukya Upanishad. And it's extreme Advaita Vedanta. And so, for instance, he says, Yatha swapne dvayabhasam spandate maya manaha. Tatha jagrat dvayabhasam spandate maya manaha. He says, just as in the dream state, just as in the dream state, the mind spins out this entire world of diversity through Maya, which is false. Exactly in the same way, the mind in the waking state also projects an illusory world of diversity. So it says that there's absolutely no difference in reality between the dream state, which you go into every night, or most nights unless we're insomniacs, and the waking state. Now Shankara, interestingly, if you ask, well, Shankara is in the same school, right? So he has to believe the same thing. No, not quite. In his commentary on the Brahma Sutra, oh, and by the way, another thing to mention about Gaudapada, it's not a coincidence that his view that the waking and dream states are an ontological par, that they're equally, that the waking state is no more real than the dream state. It's not a coincidence that that's similar to the Yogacara Buddhist view. He was influenced by Buddhists. It's well known. This is not controversial. It's so well known that one of the main, there's a lot of name calling among these different schools of Vedanta. We talked about this, I think, last time. And what was one of the favorite insults that Bhakti schools of Vedanta would lodge against Advaita Vedantins? Anyone remember? It's a pretty nasty insult. Prachanna Bodha. Alright, done. So these bhakti schools will accuse Advaita Vedantins of being Prachanna Bodhas. What does that mean? Prachanna means crypto. Not cryptocurrency. Crypto Buddhists. See, calling a Vedanta and a crypto Buddhist is pretty nasty because Buddhists do not accept the authority of the Vedas. So they're beyond the pale. And they're really getting a good dig in because they know that Gaudapada was influenced by Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka, this Madhyamika Buddhism and Yogacara Buddhism. And so they're saying, you claim to accept the Upanishads as your authority, but you're really just following the Buddhists who are heretical, who reject the authority of the Vedas. And there's some truth to it, to be honest. Now, how much truth is another, it's a scholarly matter. But one of the founding fathers of Advaita Vedanta was directly influenced by Buddhism and borrowed arguments from Nagarjuna and Yogacara Buddhism. Okay? Okay, it's a lot of background. Now coming back to this issue, the personal God. Remember, now, Shankara's commentary in the Brahma Sutra, with all this in the background, Shankara, somewhat surprisingly, instead of following his guru's guru, Gaudapada, and saying, yeah, the waking state is no more real than the dream state, he gives a number of arguments to refute that view. Of course, he's not going to come out and say, I'm refuting my guru's guru. What does he say? I'm refuting Yogacara Buddhism. You see? But it seems to me, and now you can argue with me or you can think about this as a research project in the future, it seems to me that Gaudapada held the same view as the Yogacara Buddhists in this regard. If you just look at the Mandukya Kadika, which is the text written by Gaudapada, he seems to be echoing Yogacara arguments. And so I think that there's a tension, philosophical tension between Gaudapada's view, which is that the waking state is no more real than the dream state, and Shankara's view. Shankara makes a bunch of arguments as to why the waking state is actually more real than the dream state. And he gives some arguments, like pretty straightforward ones. We sleep every night, most of us. And we dream. During the dream, assuming that we're not lucidly dreaming, we think that everything is real, right? But when we wake up, what happens? We realize it was unreal, it was just a dream all along. Shankara says, this is one piece of evidence that the dream state has a lower degree of reality than the waking state. Because every night, the reality of the dream state is negated, sublated, cancelled. You understand? Whereas, the reality of this waking state is not contradicted in such a regular fashion. But when is it cancelled? Any guesses?
Moksha.
Yeah, and how do we get moksha according to Shankara? We need to attain the knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness. Yeah. When we gain knowledge of Brahman, only then is the reality of the waking state negated. Whereas the reality of the dream state is negated on a daily basis. And then he gives a bunch of other arguments. So, do you see what I mean? This is a sort of indirect way of addressing your question. So, there's a sense in which thinking of ourselves as eternal souls is it's a higher truth, which is still not the ultimate truth. And believing in the personal God is a higher truth than being agnostic or atheist, right? But it's still not the highest truth. So in that sense, you can think of it as degrees of reality, except that that's misleading, I think, to some extent, because it's really pretty black and white at the end of the day. Empirical reality is a standpoint of ignorance. There's ignorance and there's knowledge, you see? And there's no real in between. Except you can think in a kind of more heuristic way that from the standpoint of sadhana, from the standpoint of spiritual practice, it can help us to if we just discard the reality of everything right now, it's very risky. We run the risk of not making any spiritual progress if we do that. There's an incident in the life of Sri Ramakrishna when a sadhu, a monk from a different region, like Sri Ramakrishna lived in West Bengal, he came from somewhere else, Punjab or something like that. And Sri Ramakrishna, he's a sannyasi, and so you're supposed to take a vow of celibacy. But he heard through the grapevine that he was having an affair with a woman. And so Sri Ramakrishna approached this monk and said, what is this I hear about this relationship you're having with this woman? And he says, oh, let me explain. And he was a follower of Shankara, Advaita Vedanta. So he said, you see, all of this is Maya. You see where this is going? So how can my affair with this woman alone be real? That's also Maya. You see, so we have to be very careful if we're trying to practice Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, and I don't recommend it for most people, not to mix up the two standpoints. So long as we see this world of diversity, so long as we identify with our bodies, we must believe in a personal God. You see what I mean? We should try to behave ethically, like follow all the norms and rules of empirical life, basically, and ethical life. Because it's like, Sri Ramakrishna also uses another example. He says, if you have a thorn in your foot, you can remove that by using a second thorn. And ultimately you throw both the thorns away. Right? And so, in that sense, thinking of yourself as an eternal soul, praying to a personal God, all these are kind of like that second thorn. Ultimately that will have to be discarded, but it's the only way to remove that first thorn in your foot is via the second thorn. Clear? Alright. Okay. So I think we're done with that slide. Second big question. Interesting question. Is the world real or unreal? And we can ask Rahul about what physicists say about this. Especially these days, there's like all this latest kind of research on who's the one who got the Nobel last year or something? There are newspaper articles on it, but I'm sure that it's like diluted. But
many worlds interpretations and
yeah. Is that the Everett stuff or is that different?
Yeah, that's Everett stuff.
But there's some like sensationalistic kind of newspaper article saying that like physicists have discovered that the world is an illusion or unreal. Is that similar or is that different?
Yeah, these newspaper articles tend to,
Exaggerate or kind of
sensationalize.
oversimplify, right?
Yeah.
So what is so the many worlds interpretation is not that the world's an illusion, right? But it's
Well, it's saying that thinking that this is the only separate existence, that there's something particular about this. There is an equally true world where
Yeah.
we're not in this.
Yeah. So there are other worlds, like parallel worlds,
Yeah.
which exist just as much as this one.
Yeah. So in that sense.
In that sense, right. Right. And even if we don't go that far, but the older kind of physical theories, they believe that like the table doesn't exist in an ultimate sense. Is that right? I mean, it's something more fundamental, like strings or something else. Is it?
So one way of saying it, which I think a lot of physicists now believe, is that you can't hold any part separate from the whole.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
I mean, like you can't talk of the table. We normally think about isolating the table from the rest of the
Correct. Oh,
universe.
but you can't actually do that.
You can't do that. I mean, there's no consistent way of doing it that it was
A non-arbitrary way or something.
Yeah, or something which doesn't lead to some contradictions.
Right.
Even
Okay.
in the structure of the theory.
Okay. But there has to be some internal differentiation within this vast field, right?
Yeah, so I think it's somewhat like levels of reality. Like I work in condensed matter, where we say, we don't have to worry about what the ultimate theory of everything is. We know there are electrons and solids, and we still have to figure out
At
why.
that level, you're operating at that level, basically.
Yes. And there's some people, very few, who
Yeah.
are operating at the level of, but does the quantum mechanics even make sense as
Right.
a consistent body of
Correct.
knowledge? And that's where, these sorts of things.
Right.
So
Okay.
there is this philosophy called shut up and calculate, which is to say that don't worry too much about these
Fundamental metaphysical questions. Sort of.
because it won't lead you to anything. So
Right. So these are the more hard-nosed physicists who are kind of anti-theoretical or something.
well, people say that essentially once you're close to retirement, you shouldn't do that.
You come closer to shut up and calculate view, is that the idea?
I think most practitioners are to that category. Everyone almost.
But I thought theoretical physicists are super nerdy about like all that math and
Yeah, but I think No, there are certainly people who are trying to unify, like the string theorists, who are definitely very far from, but they're also motivated by, so you can ask, is the theory internally consistent
Yeah.
in a way that everyone agrees?
Yeah.
Just like everyone agrees about Maxwell's laws of electromagnetism.
Yeah.
People have not succeeded in such a theory, and the people who are plugging at that, even though the theories they have no real consequences that are experimentally measurable. They have some consequences, but we don't have the equipment to measure it.
I see. Okay. So the theories, you wouldn't call them ad hoc, but they develop them as a way of solving puzzles or kind of whole gaps in the existing
gaps in the theory and questions of elegance.
Right. Okay.
Right, and it's very inelegant to say you have arbitrary parameters, which
Right. Okay.
like the mass of an electron or
Right.
something, which
Okay.
you just have to put in.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, so coming back to Vedanta, I guess, on the same question, is the world real or unreal? Again, different schools of Vedanta will answer this question differently. There's one outlier on this issue, as is the case with a number of other issues. The outlier is Shankara school of Advaita Vedanta. Because Shankara school, again, I have to say as a scholar that there are multiple interpretations, so I'm giving you one of the mainstream interpretations of Shankara school. According to Shankara school, the world is ultimately non-existent. And his favorite analogy is the rope snake. Or there's a rope and a snake. Or we think, okay, there is a rope. And from a distance, we look at it and we think it's a snake and we get frightened. And then we keep looking at it and then we see it's not moving. And we think, wait, is it a dead snake? And I move closer and closer and closer. And then what do I finally see? There's never a snake there. There was a rope all along. And I misperceived the rope as a snake. He says exactly the same way. The only reality is non-dual pure consciousness, Brahman. That's the rope. We misperceive that Brahman, which is our own true nature, as this table, as this chair, as this individual soul, as all of you, as the people I'm talking to, as this lecture hall, and so on and so forth. You see? Which means this entire world of names and forms, this entire world of diversity, differentiation, turns out to be like the snake. It's an illusory superimposition upon non-dual pure consciousness, which is the only reality. Yeah? Okay, so that's Shankara's view. Every other school of Vedanta holds that the world is real. So again, it's very important that you not align Vedanta with Advaita Vedanta and then say that Vedanta says X, Y, and Z. Because as you can tell now, if you have a broader understanding of the different schools of Vedanta, you'll see that Shankara's views on a lot of these matters are actually the minority view. Yeah? Most schools of Vedanta actually think that the world is ultimately real, except that all of them hold, every school of Vedanta holds that this world does not have independent existence apart from Brahman. The world cannot exist apart from Brahman. That's something that Shankara will agree with, that all the other schools, Ramanuja school, Madhva school, right? So nobody thinks that the world exists independently of Brahman, of the ultimate reality. But every school other than Shankara's believes that this world is real. It's like the wave. Does the wave have independent existence apart from the ocean? No. But does it make sense to say that the wave is unreal? I don't think so. For the time being that the wave existed, it existed, and then it dissipated eventually. But between T1 and T2, when the wave was there, before it dissipated, surely it makes sense to say that it existed, even though it only had dependent existence upon Brahman. Likewise, these other schools of Vedanta, the non-Shankaran schools of Vedanta, hold that this world is real, as long as it lasts, even though it depends entirely for its existence on Brahman, the ultimate reality. Does that make sense? Okay. This last point is kind of interesting. I've already mentioned that there's a lot of debate among the different schools of Vedanta, and so one of the interesting ones is, so in Shankara is kind of everybody's whipping boy, because he was 8th century, and he wrote these great commentaries, very influential, and so all the later Vedantic acharyas Chaitanya, Vallabha, all these others, they all read his commentaries. And because they believe in bhakti and the personal God, they have to argue against him. And so Vallabha, who's the founder of the Shuddhadvaita school of Vedanta, even the name Shuddhadvaita, he didn't coin the term, but it was his follower Giridhara who coined that term. Vallabha school is called Shuddhadvaita. What does Shuddhadvaita mean? Advaita means Advaita, non-duality. Shuddha means pure. So it's the pure non-dual school. Why is it pure non-duality? As opposed to Shankara's school of non-duality, which is in some sense impure. Why is it impure? It's not a true non-duality. Why? Because it posits a second entity alongside Brahman. What is that entity? Maya. Advaitins might say, wait a minute, we don't posit Maya is unreal. Here, Advaitins face a kind of philosophical problem, or at least arguably. What's the problem? If Advaitins say, if we ask a follower of Shankara, how do you explain my perception of this table? And that I seem to be talking to you. What do they say? Oh, it's all unreal. Right? And they say, well, but I'm still perceiving it. So how is it that I'm perceiving it in the first place? If it's unreal. There has to be some real basis behind this illusory perception. So it's very tricky. And if they say that, so what they say is that they posit that this whole world of diversity, its source is Maya. And if they say that this Maya is unreal, then they can't account for this world of diversity. If they say it's real, then they end up positing a second entity alongside Brahman. And so arguably they face this kind of philosophical catch-22. So this is what Vallabha school is saying, is that you're forced to accept the reality of Maya alongside Brahman in order to account for this illusory appearance of this world. If you insist that Maya is unreal, then you won't be able to explain this world appearance, and then your philosophy is no good. It has no value. Because it can't explain the appearances. And so they say, it's an incomplete, Shankara school is an incomplete non-dualism because there's a second entity, Maya. We give you the pure non-duality because there's only Krishna. Krishna is the only truth, the only reality. But Krishna actually manifests as all of these individual souls. Krishna actually manifests as this world of names and forms. You see?
So is Krishna also Maya? Or?
Except, see, the term Maya is a good question. Maya means different things in the hands of different schools of Vedanta. And even if you just look at Shankara school, if you look at Shankara's followers, I mean the post-Shankara Advaitins, each of them will interpret the term Maya in slightly different ways, so it gets very complicated, let alone across the different schools of Vedanta. So in Bhagavad Gita, for instance, the term Maya is used. Daivi Hyesha Gunamayi Mama Maya Duratya. Krishna says, my Maya is composed of the three gunas. Mamevi prapadyante Maya Vedānta. And those who take refuge in me transcend this Maya, which is understood as a kind of delusive power. But the Maya itself is real. Sri Ramakrishna, a modern Vedantin we can say, he distinguishes two kinds of Maya, avidya Maya and vidya Maya. The Maya of ignorance and the Maya of knowledge. And he says, what is the Maya of ignorance? He says, things like lust, anger, greed, the six enemies in spiritual life, the Shadripu, all the selfish, egoistic qualities that take us away from God, from higher reality. What is Vidya Maya? All the wonderful ethical and spiritual qualities that take us closer to God. Bhakti, devotion, detachment, compassion, unselfishness, and so on and so forth. You see. So Maya actually means different things in different schools and according to different Hindu thinkers. And so yes, these Vaishnava schools, Vallabha schools, they accept Maya as a kind of Shakti of Krishna. You see? It's not a principle of illusion in the way that it is in Advaita Vedanta, in Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. Okay? Alright. And maybe we might wrap it up with just discussing this. We have I want to cover 6 main, so maybe part 3 we'll talk about 4, 5, and 6. So today we'll discuss this last one. What is the relationship between Brahman and the world? Another huge question. Brahman meaning ultimate reality. Of course, we already know that each school of Vedanta understands Brahman in different ways. Shankara school interprets it as non-dual pure consciousness, impersonal, and Ramanuja and Madhva take Brahman to be Vishnu, and the schools of Chaitanya and Vallabha take it to be Krishna, right? The ultimate reality. But in any case, this is the question: how does this ultimate reality Brahman relate to this world that we're in now? And there's a big problem here, a big philosophical problem. God is supposed to be perfect. This world, as we all know, is not perfect. It's full of all sorts of terrible stuff, as we know, with Gaza going on and a bunch of other stuff happening. Okay, so the question is, how does this perfect, pure, infinite Brahman relate to an imperfect, impure, and ever-changing world? They seem to be complete opposites. How can there be any real relationship between them? And if there is a relationship, what exactly is that relationship? And how do we prevent the perfect, infinite God from being infected with the qualities of this imperfect, ephemeral world? It's a huge philosophical problem. In one sense, it's called the problem of evil in philosophy of religion and theology. Okay, Advaita Vedanta, as usual, is a kind of outlier in its solution. It gives a unique solution. What Shankara school says is ultimately there is no relationship between Brahman and the world. No relation, no problem. No world, no problem. Who's the rapper who is no money, no problem? More money, no problem. Anyway. Too long ago for me to remember. More money, no problems. I think that's Puff Daddy or something. This is like 90s rap when I was in high school. Anyway, okay. So, Shankara says, all of your philosophical problems, this whole problem of evil, this stems from the assumption that the world is real on the one hand, and that Brahman is real on the other hand, and that there has to be therefore some kind of relationship. But if we dismiss the reality of the world, no problem. If all that exists is Brahman, no problem. So this is Shankara's view. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. He calls this Vivartavada. Vivarta means illusory appearance. It's the doctrine of illusory appearance. What is the relation between Brahman and this world? This world is an illusory appearance of Brahman in exactly the way that a snake is an illusory appearance of the rope. There was just the rope all along. There was never any snake. It wasn't that a snake appeared in the rope for a certain amount of time and then disappeared. There never was a snake. You see? So that's why Shankara school is not fond of the ocean wave analogy. Why? Because the ocean wave analogy implies that the wave actually existed for a certain amount of time and then disappeared, right? The rope and snake analogy is not like that. Another analogy that Shankara likes, a mirage in a desert. Because there was never any water in that. It looks, I'm very thirsty, I think there's a lake, I come closer and I find, there's a mirage. You see? Okay. So, Advaita Vedanta is the only school within Vedanta which holds this Vivartavada doctrine. That the world is ultimately non-existent, it's an illusory appearance of Brahman. But it gets a little bit more complicated because, okay, so the opposite of Vivartavada is what's called Parinamavada. Parinama means real transformation. So this is the doctrine that, yes, there is a relationship between Brahman and this world. What is that relationship? Brahman actually, in some aspect, actually transforms into this world. Just as what? Milk can be transformed into curds or butter. It's literally the same substance, which becomes another thing. That's called the doctrine of Parinama, the doctrine of real transformation. You see how Parinamavada is the direct opposite of Shankara's Vivartavada, right? Now, we have to bring into play two more technical terms here. According to Vishishtadvaita Vedanta and Veda Vedanta, Brahman is both the efficient and the material cause of this world. Nimitta Karana and the Upadana Karana. So, to give you a simple analogy here, to help you understand these two kinds of causality. Imagine a potter, P-O-T-T-E-R, not Harry Potter, but somebody who makes clay, pots, out of clay. Okay, I'm the potter and I've just made a pot. What is the instrumental cause of the pot? I am, the potter. The potter is the instrumental cause of the pot, the agent who creates the pot. What is the material cause of the pot? The upadana karana. The clay itself. Because the clay pots are nothing but clay. The material of the pot is nothing but that clay. You follow? So now, these schools of Vedanta, Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta and all the different sub-schools of Bheda Vedanta, they hold that Brahman is both the instrumental cause of this world, meaning the supreme agent who actually creates this world, the potter making the pots, and also the material cause. This is more interesting. This world is made of the same stuff in a sense as Brahman itself. And the Mundaka Upanishad uses a beautiful analogy, the analogy of a spider. And this is probably not biologically correct, but they use this. It's so yator nanabi sujate grinate cha. Just as an urnanabi, a spider, projects a web out of itself, and then eventually retracts that back into its own body. Just so, Brahman projects this world of names and forms out of itself, and then eventually retracts it back into itself. Because in Hinduism, creation is cyclical. Expansion, contraction. We're currently in an expanded state, in the manifest state. Eventually, there will be I think what this is called a big crunch. Am I right? Yeah. And then it contracts into a seed state, bija avastha. But the world is never completely destroyed. So I think it's accurate to say that Vedanta accepts, Hinduism in general, accepts the law of the conservation of energy in a sense. It's just that the energy changes into a different form, you see. This body, when it dies, it'll still be there in a different form. It'll just get converted into different forms of matter. So in the same way, this entire universe will contract into a seed state, and then eventually again, after millions of years, will expand again into another universe. Okay? Okay. There's a big problem here with this, or at least there seems to be a problem with this view. The problem is what I mentioned above. If you take Brahman to be both the instrumental and the material cause of this world, then you seem to be implicating God in the evils of this world. Because then all the evil in this world is also Brahman in a sense. But doesn't that impugn the goodness of God and the perfection of God? So this is a huge problem. This is exactly why Shankara, or one of the reasons, that he simply denies that there's any reality in this world. But there's another solution, adopted by Madhva. So this is a different solution. One strategy for avoiding the problem is Shankara's, throw out the baby with the bathwater. No world, no problem. Madhva's solution is a bit different. Where do I get to Madhva here? Okay, there we go. What he does is, he rejects Parinamavada. He says, Brahman is the instrumental cause of this world, but not the material cause of this world. So Brahman has created this world, but this world is radically different from Brahman. You see, the problem arises if we take Brahman also to be the material cause of this world, because then the evil in this world is also in God in some sense. This is Madhva's kind of logic. You see, so if we take Vishnu to be only the instrumental cause of this world, but not the material cause, then we avoid this problem evil, and God can still be perfect and infinite on the one hand, and this world can be evil and imperfect and finite on the other, and there still won't be a problem. There is still sort of a problem. Why does this perfect God create this imperfect world? So it's not like it solves all the problems, but it makes the problem more manageable. You see? So according to Madhva school, there's a fundamental ontological difference, Bheda, between Brahman and the world, and therefore Brahman is the efficient but not the material cause of the world. But he agrees, Madhva school agrees with all the other Bhakti schools of Vedanta, and even agrees with Shankara school, which is that the world has no independent existence apart from Brahman. Shankara will go further and say it's not just that the world has no independent existence apart from Brahman, it has no existence at all, at the end of the day. Okay? Alright, I think this is a good place to stop. We'll start with this fourth question of what is the relation between Brahman and the individual soul next time. So there's a lot of information to take in. Do you guys have any questions?
So another
Yeah.
question related to Sri Ramakrishna. Where does Nirakar and Sakar fit into Nirguna?
Very good. That's a very good question. I think this creates a lot of confusion. I'm going to erase this and then explain that. Okay, so there are two sets of terms: Nirguna, Saguna, Nirakara, Sakara. All right. Now, Nirguna means without attributes. This means attributes. Nir means without. And another way of putting that is that it's impersonal. Some scholars say that that's not fair. We should say not impersonal, but transpersonal. Whatever floats your boat, but I hope you understand the idea. It means even the omni-attributes of the personal God, the omniscient Vishnu, the omnipotent Vishnu, none of that's true of the ultimate reality according to Shankara's school. They believe in Nirguna Brahma, you see? It's not true that the ultimate reality is omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly loving. None of that's true. In that sense, impersonal or transpersonal, you see? So Saguna is exactly the opposite. It means with attributes. Which attributes? All the wonderful omni-attributes of the personal God. Omniscience, omnipotence, and so on. He loves us. He responds to our prayers. He creates this world. He preserves this world. He destroys this world in the end. Do you see? Okay. So Saguna would be with attributes and the personal God. Now, we get to this other set of terms. Nirakara. Akara means what? Means form. Nir means without. This means with. This is with form. Now, this gets interesting. So now, we can use these four terms to kind of, going back to the first question. The nature of Brahman. So, using these terms, what is Shankara's understanding of the nature of ultimate reality?
Nirguna and Nirakara.
Yeah, exactly. Nirguna and Nirakara. Nirguna and Nirakara is Shankara. Nirguna because it's impersonal, non-dual pure consciousness. Nirakara because there's no question of having form. If it has no attributes and it's not personal, how can there be a form? Right? Okay. What about Ramanuja school? They believe in the ultimate reality as Vishnu. Ramanuja and Madhva, for instance. What terms? Saguna, definitely. Eh, yeah, actually, I mean, this would go here. Like I would say, Ramanuja and Madhva. Yeah, I think it's most accurate to say that they believe in Saguna, Sakara, because they have elaborate descriptions of the form of Vishnu, with the earrings, holding a mace and a discus, and he sleeps on the serpent bed, the Shesha, on this ocean, in Vishnu Vaikuntha Loka, and this whole thing. There's elaborate descriptions, beautiful descriptions of what he looks like. It means Sakara, not just Saguna, but Sakara. Now we get to an interesting question. What is the Sikh? You know Sikhism?
Nirakara.
And yeah, but is it Nirguna or Saguna?
Saguna.
Yeah, this is interesting. It's Saguna but Nirakara. Sikhism. During Sri Ramakrishna's time, there was a sect, a Hindu reform movement, that also held this view. Do you know what it was called?
Arya Samaj.
Brahma Samaj. Brahma Samaj, not Arya Samaj. Arya Samaj, actually maybe Arya Samaj too, but I think it's more complicated in that case. But Brahma Samaj definitely. So Ram Mohan Roy, Keshav Chandra Sen, Devendranath Tagore, who was the father of Rabindranath Tagore, many others, Vijay Krishna Goswami. It was a huge phenomenon in 19th century India, and especially Bengal. Okay? Brahma Samaj also believes in ultimate reality is Saguna but Nirakara, formless and personal. That's why Brahma Samaj people were on a campaign against idol worship, what they call idol worship. All these forms of God, it's all superstition. All these rituals, it's all kind of crude but they believe in the personal God. They're not followers of Shankara. You see. Islam, what's their view of God? Saguna Nirakara. That's why they also don't believe in Christ as an incarnation. That they disagree with Christianity on that point. You see, they believe that Christ was a prophet, but not God. Because how can God incarnate in human form? That would become Sakara. Which they don't believe in. They don't believe in worshiping God with any kind of form. That's why they reject Hinduism, of course. You see. So, Islam, Sikhism, Brahma Samaj, there are probably others who believe in Saguna but Nirakara. And if you take Hinduism as a whole, and for instance like Sri Ramakrishna for instance, he was vast and he experienced God in many different forms and aspects. And on that basis he said, God is impersonal, Nirguna, and God is equally personal, Saguna. God is both with form, Sakara, and God is without form, Nirakara. And he uses the analogy of an ocean. And he says, imagine that the ultimate reality is this infinite divine Satchitananda, which is this infinite ocean. He says, under the influence of the cooling breeze of bhakti, of devotion, that ocean forms different ice formations. These are different icebergs or something. Differently shaped icebergs. Each one of those icebergs corresponds to a form of the personal God. Sakara, Saguna. Okay, the ocean is both Nirguna and Saguna, we can say it in that sense. And it forms into Saguna, Sakara in these different iceberg formations. Okay? And then the story continues with this beautiful analogy. He says, but with the rising of the sun of knowledge, Gyanasuriya, Gyanshurju in Bengali, these ice forms melt. And if the story ended there, followers of Shankara would be very happy because they'll say, see, with the rising of the sun of knowledge, the ice forms melt, the forms of God melt, and what's left? Nirguna Nirakara. Ha, we're vindicated. The ultimate reality is only non-dual pure consciousness. But the story doesn't end there. Sri Ramakrishna says, but in some places the ice doesn't melt at all. And he calls these, he says, in some places the ice doesn't melt at all. We have what he calls Nitya Sakara. Nitya Sakara. It's a very interesting idea. Eternal forms of God. You see, what does he mean by that? To understand what he means, I think we have to have some understanding of the different schools of Vedanta. We'll get to this next class, part 3 of Crash Course in Vedanta. This is related to the question of what does ultimate liberation look like? We talk about moksha as the final goal for all Hindus. What is moksha? In a negative sense, it's liberation from the cycle of rebirth, and it's liberation from suffering. Great. In a positive sense, what is it? And there are different answers according to different schools. Advaita Vedanta says, forget about all this nonsense about going to some kind of heaven. No coming and going in the ultimate state of liberation. All there is resting in your own swarupa, your own true essence, as non-dual, pure consciousness. Because everything else is an illusion anyway. Even those higher heavens and all that, all illusory. Only real from the empirical standpoint. But what do the bhakti schools of Vedanta say? I mean, I'm just anticipating a more detailed discussion next time. They believe in an eternal loka, an eternal heaven, in which the liberated jiva, the liberated soul, dwells in a loving relationship, in eternal communion with their beloved form of the personal God. So those followers of Vishnu will dwell in Vaikuntha Loka for an eternity. It's not a temporary heaven. They will dwell for an eternity with Vishnu, lovingly serving and worshiping him. You see. But what about the followers of Krishna? Like this Vallabha school, Chaitanya school? they call it Goloka or Vrindavana, the eternal Vrindavana, not this Vrindavana here on earth, but the one in the higher Loka. It's an eternal heaven in which you dwell for eternity with Krishna and lovingly serve Krishna and worship him, like the gopis, lovingly worshiping and sporting with Krishna. You see, Nitya Sakara. Because in that same passage, Sri Ramakrishna says, what is Nitya Sakara? He says in some philosophies, there's this idea of Nitya Krishna, Nitya Bhakta. Chinmoy Shan, Chinmoy Dham. Shama, Krishna is Chinmoy, is consciousness. And so is his Dhamma, his eternal abode. You see? So in some places the ice doesn't melt. So how do you understand this? It means that, so this is my tradition, so I'm just, but I like it because it's so vast and because it accepts everything. And it doesn't go into hierarchies, into this higher and lower, that ultimately only this is real, this is not real. Ultimately only this yoga will take you to the highest, but you know. So that's what I see as one of the benefits of this philosophy, which is that you can accept everybody's perspective without saying that my perspective is better or higher or truer than yours. Any other questions? Yeah.
If Advaita believe that, or they believe that the personal God is, I guess, an illusion. What is the point of prayer? Or is it just like something? Is the fact that it's an illusion a good, like that people partake in prayer a good thing? Because
Yeah, great question. So the answer is, imagine I'm dreaming. It's not hard to imagine, we all dream. And now, imagine that suddenly I'm lucidly dreaming, which means I know I'm in a dream, but it's a nightmare. It's not a very pleasant dream. And my aim is to get out of the dream. How do I wake up from this dream? I don't like this dream, I want to wake up from it. What do? I seek out a dream guru. That guru says you should worship God. I said, who's this God? There's a God out there that you should pray to wake you up from this terrible nightmare. I said, but is that God real? No, it's a dream God, but that dream God will help you to wake up from this dream. And what does that, but doesn't that make you unreal too, oh guru? Yes, I'm also your dream guru. I'm the guru in your dream to get you up, to wake you up from this dream. And so that's the status. You pray within your dream to a dream God, and you read the dream scriptures, and you listen to follow the instructions of your dream guru, and you practice compassion toward dream people in order ultimately to break the dream, to wake up from the dream. And then you realize when you wake up, well, wait a minute, none of that was real. And so you use, remember the thorn analogy. You use the second thorn to remove the first thorn, and then you throw out both. That's the answer. Heady stuff. Any other questions? Everything is crystal clear. So let me ask you, first of all, how much of this information is new to you? I mean, I'm sure you had heard the term Vedānta before, right? So quite a bit of it is new. Yeah. And of all the schools of Vedānta, which one is most familiar to you? Pushti Marga, interesting. Your family is, are you Gujarati or something?
Yeah.
Ah, that's why, see? It's very popular in Gujarat. Yeah, that's interesting. Most people will say Advaita Vedanta. Yeah. But I'm glad to hear there's a Vallabha, somebody representing Vallabha there. I had a PhD student in India who did his PhD thesis on Vallabha. He would go to Gujarat to stay with this, in this institute, Vallabha Institute, working with Vallabha scholars. So yeah, it's good to just have a broader understanding of how complex and how broad Vedanta is as a tradition within Hinduism. So I think it's fair to say that most Hindus are Vedantins, except that what kind of Vedantin is the question. And then you get some people lean more toward Pushti Marga, some people Advaita Vedanta, some people Ramanuja. In South India, you get a lot of people who are Ramanujites. There's another place where it's very Madhva oriented, Dvaita. You see? So if we get a broader sense of the overall Vedantic landscape, we'll better appreciate the diversity within Hinduism. That's the beauty of Hinduism, actually. Because Hindus have this concept of Ishta Devata. the preferred form of God. In this room, we have, what, about 10 people or so. Each one of us might be worshipping a different form of God. Maybe one of us, like the Sikhs or Muslims, Nirakara Savana. But we can all be perfectly good Hindus.
There's an Vedānta.
Vedānta. Yeah, you take your pick. Go ahead. No problem. Exactly. So I mean, even though Hinduism is kind of complex and vast and confusing in a certain way, if you go a little bit more deeply, you can, one of its greatest virtues is that it's not a one-size-fits-all religion. One of the biggest problems with some other religions is that it's more of a one-size-fits-all. My way or the highway, you have to follow this way or you're beyond the pale, you're a heretic, you should be ostracized or potentially killed. But no, in Hinduism, there's one divine reality, infinite divine reality, who lovingly manifests to each of us in the form that we love. Sri Krishna would say that God is Bhakta Vatshal. Bhakta Vatsal means he's a lover of his devotees. So if you believe that, if God really loves us, if that's true, wouldn't God manifest himself to you in the form that you like to think of God in? Naturally. So a typical Hindu will have in his or her shrine maybe 10 different pictures of God. You'll have Ganesha, you'll have Kali, you'll have Krishna, no problems. You might have one who's your Ishtadevata, but that doesn't mean that you're going to not worship God as Krishna at the same time. You see what I mean? And with regard to spiritual practices, it's equally vast. Each person has a different personality, different temperament, different strengths, different weaknesses. And so why should we say that there's only one royal path to God realization, or to the highest goal, salvation or liberation, whatever you want to call it? For people who are very dynamic, Karma Yoga might be the ideal path. For some people who are extremely brainy and intellectual, Jnana Yoga might be the ideal path. For people who are very devotional by nature, Bhakti Yoga might be the path. Some people might find a combination of these yogas to be the most effective path. Some people love meditation. Raja Yoga could be their path, or Dhyana Yoga. Not a one-size-fits-all religion. I think that's one of the great virtues. Critics will say that makes this religion a kind of a hodgepodge or a total confusion. It's full of contradictions. But where some people see contradictions and confusion, others will see the greatness of the religion. So think about that. All right? Thank you. When are we meeting? Oh, well, let's finish first. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Hari Om Tat Sat.